computer. All right, so welcome back to our honor study topic Zoom presentations. Tonight's theme is theme 5, and it is, sorry, brain freeze.
Resistance.
Resistance, reform.
Rebellion and revolution.
Thank you. And our guest host tonight is the one and only Barbara Wolf-Ebert. So I will hand it over to her and enjoy the presentation tonight, guys.
Thank you, Nicole. And I'm so excited to be back, and especially excited to be back with theme 5. And I mentioned this before as a political scientist. I study conflict and peace, and so this is a great topic for me, but there's also a lot of issues that you can explore with theme 5, and so I'm super excited to be talking about this today. And let me start by sharing my screen. Share. Okay. Okay, here we are. So here we go. So tonight we will talk about theme 5, and like Nicole mentioned, theme 5's topic is resistance, reform, rebellion, and revolution. And the discussion question you wanted me to focus on tonight is, how will the resistance movements of the last year affect our legacy? So today I thought we'll go about it a little bit differently. Since Catalyst is rapidly approaching, most of us are finishing up our year, and we are about to start, or maybe start thinking about starting the next Honors in Action project. And so today I thought we'll have a little bit more interactive presentation where we brainstorm together like you would with your chapters, and how you can get jump started to your Honors in Action project if you were focusing on theme 5. So we'll briefly review the honor study topic, and most of you will be familiar with it. Quickly discuss theme 5, and then we will look at how the resistance movement of the last year affect our legacy. And then we will start with our brainstorming. What are some examples in the news? What changes have we seen? How do you start with your chapter on an Honors in Action project? Questions you might want to consider when you're looking at theme 5, and how to make it relevant, just a few tips for your chapter. And while I hope that this will be interactive, we will still hopefully have time at the end for Q&A. If you have any general questions about Honors in Action, how to do your research, what to avoid, how to start your action component, or anything related to it. So just to recap, the 2020-2021 honor study topic is the thing. So, and the theme, so theme 5, is the lens through which members investigate the overall topic. And again, the honor study topic is to the 7th generation, inheritance and legacy. So we asked, what did we inherit from our ancestors, and what legacy can we leave for future generations? As you might remember, the Ojibwe culture is credited with the concept of thinking about decisions with the 7th generation in mind. They believe they are connected to the first people who walked on this earth, and to those people who are yet to be born. And this concept of inheritance and legacy applies to topics in all areas of our lives, and it applies to all themes in the honor study topic guide. So you can apply it to science, to music, to sports, to the arts, to politics, economics, finance, really to any area in your life. And when you explore the honor study topic, it might help you to think about what Rick Hill Sr., Tuscarora Bear of the Beaver Clan and former special assistant to the director of the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian said, "The people living today are the bridge between ancestors and descendants." So when you think about the honor study topic, think about this image of the bridge. So today we will talk about theme 5, and again, the theme is resistance, reform, rebellion, and revolution. Remember, the honor study topic is the thing. So even within this topic, we want to keep in mind the legacy and the inheritance of resistance movements. Resistance can be social, economic, and political, and sometimes it can be all three things. It can involve different actors, can involve different situations, and take on many different forms. For example, it can be peaceful or it can be violent. Of all the themes this year, like I said before, theme 5 is my favorite topic, not only because it's political, and as a political scientist, I study conflict and peace for a living, but also because there's so much you can do with this topic. When I'm starting any honors in action research, I start by looking at the newspapers and the news to see what issues are related to the theme and which are current. So to get us started today, and maybe to get you started in your chapters, I want you to take a minute and think about which resistance movements you have seen in the news, or which ones you or your chapter are particularly interested in. And there were a lot this past year in all different areas. And so I'm sure you have some ideas of what's been discussed or something you feel especially passionate about. Raymond, what was one of the topics you were interested in?
I think the one I was interested in was the fight for 15.
Mm-hmm.
So raising the minimum wage to $15, and that would be like nationwide, not just state by state, but trying to do a federally mandated $15 an hour livable wage.
Yeah, and that has been in the news a lot, and we can really see that this is a movement where grassroots and corporations, activists combine. Yeah, anyone else? I don't see all the names, or I would call the names. Okay, so let me see. All right, so if we don't have any volunteers, I'll give you a list of things I have seen in the news and you probably will recognize as well. So in the last year alone, we have seen the rise of various protest movements, both in the United States and around the globe. For example, with the COVID pandemic changing how we go about our daily lives, there have been anti-lockdown protests, not only in the US, but all over the world. We have seen a rise in anti-vaccination movements all across the country. Another one, after the presidential elections, there were protests from both sides of the aisles. We saw Biden-Harris victory celebrations, and we also saw Stop the Steal demonstrations, which protested the election results. We have seen the violent insurgents storming the US Capitol on January 6th, which turned a peaceful protest that was legally permitted by the National Park Service into a violent protest and into an insurgency. Black Lives Matter has been at the forefront again this past year. We have seen the Juneteenth celebrations. We have seen movements for criminal justice reform, police and policing reform, women's marches and Me Too movements, of course. Another one are the LGBTQ movements, the Black Trans Lives Matter movement, which brings awareness to violence against Black transgender women. And yesterday, you might have seen it all over social media, was International Transgender Day. Then we have seen the Black Friday Amazon protest, the Make Amazon Pay movement, where warehouse workers and climate activists united to demonstrate or raise awareness and resist the working conditions and the climate impact of Amazon and other big corporations. Protest actions were organized in Brazil, in Germany, in India, Mexico, of course, in the United States, in France, and in other countries. Actual actions varied. In Germany, for example, thousands of warehouse workers went on strike, while some locales staged protests outside of Amazon headquarters. The climate marches have been big last year, especially the September climate strikes. And you remember the Swedish youth activist Greta Thunberg, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, who was named 2019 Person of the Year, the youngest person named that. And of course, we've seen pro-democracy protests. Especially what I think about are the Hong Kong protests that started off with a New Year's Day rally and protested the resistance or the oppression by the Chinese government. And of course, there are a lot of other great examples you can use. Remember, no matter what topic you explore in theme 5, emphasize inheritance and legacy to the 7th generation. Also, the topic is meant to be viewed in terms of society rather than individual people. And so some of these movements have led to changes or have led to other movements. So for example, there have been changes or calls for changes in the healthcare field, equal access to vaccinations and to healthcare coverage. We've also seen the difficulties of anti-vaccination movements because of the distrust in government-funded immunization efforts as a result of racial injustices, such as the Tuskegee Project and other projects you might remember. In the workplace, we have seen a big stride for unionization. The message that Biden gave when he put the Cesar Chavez statue behind the Resolute desk during his address, the symbolism of that was huge. He's the strongest union supporter, and students in your chapter might want to read the Cesar Chavez piece in the leadership development program. And one question we might ask is, how do leaders or people overcome fear of retaliation, especially in migrant or other vulnerable labor communities, to mobilize their base? We have seen changes in climate policies where companies are going green in response to investors, shareholders, and consumer demands. In the education sector, we have seen a lot of changes or demand for changes. Just think about financing. Talks about free college education, free education and support from K through 12, student debt forgiveness, and we've seen forced online virtual education and how that might change our legacies for the future years. Again, we have seen policing, and criminal justice reforms after the George Floyd killings and the Black Lives Matter movement. And in the finance sector, for example, stock and shareholders, as well as consumers, moving companies to invest in green resources and products. So within theme 5, just looking at the past year, there are many different issues for your chapter to explore. And again, with PTK Catalyst, a catalyst, not capitalist, with PTK Catalyst rapidly approaching, many of you are probably just starting to think about this year's Honors in Action project. Remember that your Honors in Action project always starts with research. When developing your research question, you want to start broad with many ideas like we did just now. And then you want to use your research to narrow down your focus and come up with one specific research question. Make sure that the pursuit of your intellectual curiosity is interdisciplinary and global. Though your chapter will likely work at the local level for the Honors in Action component, be sure to initially consider your theme through an international lens. Expert sources also should be clearly wide-ranging and represent different points of view about the honor study topic and the theme that you and your chapter select from the honors program guide. But now the question comes, how do you get started? In your chapter, you probably have members with all sorts of different backgrounds and interests. You might have international students from China, from Russia, from Europe, from Iran, from Africa. You might have domestic students. You might have non-traditional students. So it is always a challenge with so many interesting and timely issues to agree on a project and come together as a chapter. So today we will think about how to get started on this new project. A great starting point for theme 5 is to come up with a good definition of resistance. So let's try this again. So take a moment, think about how would you define resistance, and what is the difference between resistance, rebellion, and revolution? Because clearly in the honor study program guide, they didn't just use synonyms to make it more appealing, but there is a difference between these different things. And this is something you can also discuss in your chapter. And it doesn't have to be super scientific. It can also be reflecting of your different viewpoints and where you're coming from. So how would you describe or define resistance? Anyone?
Normally, I find resistance tends to be passive, as in, say, Gandhi or something like that, as opposed to an open rebellion, which would be like the coal wars in the Midwest and out west, and revolutions like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, etc.
Any other ideas on how you might define it?
I stand by that. Resistance, I would say, is kind of like, holding your ground, not really moving back, not really going with. And rebellion is more active.
Okay. Yeah. Anyone else? So if you look at definitions commonly, especially in the political fields, resistance are always in opposition to something. And usually these are daily acts of opposition to oppression and injustice. Rebellion, like both of you said, is something more extraordinary. It is embodied in specific events, protests, and moments that upset the order of daily life. So it is a more explosive, momentary instance in which resistance takes more of a concrete, combative form in the streets in popular protests. And one thing we often think about traditionally are riots. So the riots we have seen in response to Ferguson and in response to Flint. A revolution is a little bit different. While resistance, and you've mentioned this before, while resistance and rebellions are ways to address the flaws in societal systems, revolution is often thought of as a wholesale rejection of it. It is a violent or a non-violent overthrow of the societal system. So it is intended to bring about systemic change. It can be abrupt and sudden, or it can be slow and long and carefully planned. And then when we have resistance, rebellion, and revolution, we think about reform. And reform is in the topic for a specific reason. And so why do you think reform is part of the honor study topic? How does that relate to resistance, rebellion, and revolution? think a moment, because yes, go ahead.
Reform essentially rectifies the cause of the resistance and the rebellion as long as the overall end result of the revolution.
Yes. Anyone else? I think this is a great definition. And the one thing we want to keep in mind is that reform, which is basically a change, like you just said, can be both positive and it can be counterproductive for the rebellious and revolutionary energy progression. So when you make small incremental changes, that can be counterproductive. If you think about Ferguson and Baltimore examples, then you think about how police body cameras pale in terms of what is actually necessary to attend to the crisis that causes people to erupt in such a dramatic way. So this reform is so small and incremental that it somehow suppresses or alleviates or slows down the rebellious and revolutionary elements, but doesn't really bring about the desired change you just mentioned, right? There is no real adjustment to it. So when we think about reform, as with anything, when we study or research theme 5, they are both pros and cons. And when you do your research, you will find, or you should look for academic sources that provide both sides of these views. So you find opposing viewpoints and then see which ones you think are most applicable to what you're doing or are most convincing. Oh, okay, it's not moving. Give me a second. Here we are. So another question to ask is, if you want to start this, if you were to start a revolution, what is a good way to do it? So you could look at and know all of the political history and see how people formed rebellions. So that could be a guidepost. So you could explore the effectiveness of different forms of resistance. And one of you mentioned before, peaceful versus non-peaceful movements. So sometimes one leads to the other, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes both overlap. And there are a lot of current examples too. Resistance is the most common form of standing up for or against something. So there can be a big discussion in your chapter, and maybe we can look at it now, about the non-violent directed action, like peaceful and non-peaceful resistance. What are your thoughts about peaceful versus violent resistance? Do you have any examples? Do you think one is better or more effective than the other?
Well, I would definitely use for the BLM protests or the BLM movement as it started peaceful, and take Seattle, for example, when it was peaceful and then it got out of control. Businesses were burning, streets were basically closed, and then that non-peaceful aspect pretty much trickled down the system. So it was happening in Chicago as non-peaceful, it was happening throughout the nation as non-peaceful. But like you said, it can start out peaceful, and then a few bad apples could get together, and then it can just turn like that, like a light switch. So for me, I think peaceful protest is better than non-peaceful, because once it turns non-peaceful, you kind of drown out your message you were trying to send, because now everybody's committing crimes, everybody's doing this, and it's watering down your overall message. But that's just my opinion on it.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone who disagrees with that, who sees it differently?
I mostly agree.
No.
Okay, I'll go ahead and go. So peaceful protests can easily turn into non-peaceful protests. It just takes one person on one side or the other. Some of the Black Lives Matter protests you talked about were a good example. I think it was it Kent State or something like that, where fire was opened on peaceful protesters that were unarmed. That's another example. And unfortunately, is nonviolent violent protests or things that happen violently are ones that are remembered more in history than the nonviolent ones. A lot of people aren't going to remember the nonviolent protests or the marches that didn't have anything happen in them. I mean, there's a few rare exemptions, but that's sadly is the violence and the open conflict and the arrests and things like that and the harm actually do generate more interest and more, news media, whether it be good or bad.
Anyone else?
I look at, and I tend to look at the labor movement more than others. When it was peaceful, basically nothing happened until Mother Mary Jones and all of the others in the labor movement actually got to a point where they got fed up and said, no, enough of this. And if we have to take up arms or whatever, we will get our point across. And I think it would be great if business would listen, but in most cases, they'll give you a little bit of, for lack of a better word, a little bit of honey, and then it'll be business as normal.
So, like we've seen from this discussion, there is not necessarily agreement. And so I could think of a great research project where you pick a certain topic, whether it's the labor movement or Black Lives Matter or democratic actions or resistance movements in the Middle East or in Asia, and explore which ones are more effective. So are violent protests more effective, or are non-violent protests more effective? So I can think of some peaceful protests that were very effective. So for example, the Easter marches in East Germany and the former Soviet satellite states did not turn violent and topple the Soviet regime after all. I can think about India. Gandhi is of course well known, and it's one person who made a big impact. But the most common form of resistance in India are actually hunger strikes. So people sit in front of the parliament and don't leave and don't eat until change has happened, which is a very different culture from how we look at it. Then if you think about Rosa Parks, there was one person who changed the course of history just because she decided she doesn't want to sit in the back of the bus. And that was a non-violent protest. We can also see, if we think about legacy and inheritance, and I'm from Germany, so I'm a little biased maybe, but the Easter marches and the collapse of the Soviet Union send a message to China. And when you look at the Tiananmen Square incident and then the Tiananmen Square massacre, it shows you that the peaceful resistance was met by a violent governmental response out of a fear that you might have similar secession movements by Hong Kong or Taiwan, and that government wanted to suppress that. So how the acts we do now can have a long-lasting change. Also, if you think about peaceful change and peaceful resistance, artistic expressions of resistance are huge at the moment. Pop culture in Russia and Asian countries are even oppressed, like pop artists are oppressed by their governments just because of the immense power they have through their non-violent cultural movement. And then, of course, if we think about violent movement, there are a lot we can think about. We can think about Egypt and Syria, the Palestine and Israel conflict, where actually violent and non-violent resistance reforms mashed. We can think about the Capitol siege. There are a lot of interesting academic articles and books about this topic. Most recent research by Harvard professors Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, that's their book, explains why civil resistance campaigns attract more absolute numbers of people and therefore are more effective. So there is a lot of interesting research and a lot of discussion I think your chapter could get into. Another way to get started on it, and another way, thing to think about, are what you mentioned, social media and the internet. So how do the internet and social media help or prevent rebellions or revolutions from happening? And how do you use the latest technologies for your resistance movements? And we can think about the different functions social media performs, right? Social media can have an agenda setting function. So they basically tell us what to talk about just by being present online. They can raise awareness, they can mobilize, and then they can create lasting change. So the role of social media is huge in today's age. And one thing I would like to ask you is, what do you think, do social media and the internet help with lasting resistance? Or are they just tools for mobilization, but not necessarily effective for long-term change?
Tools, but not necessarily effective.
So tools for mobilization, so to get people together, to organize protests, violent or non-violent, but do they actually bring about lasting change? Because the goal of any resistance or revolution or rebellion, of course, is to bring about change. And so how effective are the social media?
I believe that can plant a seed to start the change, but overall social media itself does not, cause the change. So a lot of people on social media, they'll share, like, and do things that they don't even fully read or understand. Every once in a while I go back and I clear out pages that, like I was like, what the heck is this? This is so long. These pages don't even really exist anymore. I get rid of them. I think a lot of that is just, it's almost like a 10 to 1. For 10 people that pay attention to it, or you think they pay attention to it, they're not really paying attention.
Anyone else? What do you think about social media?
I think at first social media was a good tool to get the attention you wanted to have for a certain aspect or certain issue, and then it just adapted over time and became this tool for people to use to create an agenda, to mobilize. So I think like any piece of technology, I think it slowly adapted into something else. It slowly became this tool where you could use it for what it wasn't meant for. For example, I remember when all these riots were going on with the BLM movement, people would go there and they would just start going live on Facebook, filming everything, bringing you into the action so you could see what's going on. So I think from that aspect, those people on the ground were actually bringing more attention to the issue because now you're able to see firsthand what's going on around you. But I think it's being used more for mobilization because, like Brandon was saying, I could put on Facebook, hey, support BLM by changing your cover photo to just being black. But does that mean you support it, or does that mean you're just following what somebody else is saying? So it's just tricky. It's hard to actually, for me, it's hard to determine if it plays a significant role in raising awareness to mobilization.
But it clearly has opened up a lot of avenues for, like you said, mobilization and awareness. So if you think about International Transgender Visibility Day, like I mentioned before, was all over Facebook yesterday. Other LGBTQ issues, Black Lives Matter, like you just mentioned, it's all over social media. That didn't happen 50 years ago. So these are things that have been brought to the agenda and where awareness has been raised. And if we think about mobilization, it is amazing how through Twitter, how someone can influence people so much with so little information, how you can organize the massive crowds in such small amount of time. That clearly was not possible before. And if you think about the Arab Spring, social media played a huge role. So now let's compare this. So in your chapter, you could compare this, well, look at Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech. See how many people were in that audience. They didn't have social media then, and they were still able to mobilize. So how do information pass? And how do we capture and mobilize grassroots efforts? And how do we then build on that to create lasting change? Which tools do we have that are most effective? Is it the social media and is it technology? Or is it the charisma and conviction of leaders who are able to mobilize the broader base? Then you can also look at issues like Soviet interference in US political elections through fake YouTube videos, through fake and artificial Facebook accounts, which is a good and interesting and in the news example of a way to use social media to foment resistance. Also, when you think about social media, we have 3 mega companies who control social media. So you could do a research project where you look at social media or media outlets like Fox News and CNN and compare the news stories. So how is the same story represented either across different media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, newspapers, or how is it is the same story represented according to the media outlet and political agendas? And then you could code it accordingly, and then you can look at the outcome, which would be a fascinating research project. Or even better, look at how a story is represented in selected media in the US and compare it to international news media. So social media clearly play a big role, and that's something we can look at for theme 5. Other factors are exogenous and endogenous factors we might look at. So how crisis and even reform lead to or repress resistance. So they are natural, environmental, and health disasters. And of course, last year, the COVID pandemic is the big issue. So you have resistance to wearing masks, to social distancing, and getting vaccinated. And all that's a form of resistance, and it's in the news right now. Then you have national tragedies, such mass shootings just this week in Orange, California, where 4 were shot dead and 1 child was killed. And what does it do about the restrictions placed on gun ownerships and resistance to gun ownerships and resistance to government reform to limit that? You can also look at political reforms. There may be resistance to the new infrastructure bill proposed by President Biden, or the Georgia voting laws that was just passed. Or I don't know if you heard about the curfew for all men from 6 p.m. that was suggested by Baroness Jenny Jones from the Greens Party of England, and which is meant as a measure to minimize violence against women. And I would not be surprised if we see a huge resistance against that. Also, there are economic crises that might bring about resistance or rebellion or revolution or even reforms. So calls for boycotts of corporations such as Delta Airlines, Coca-Cola, and Home Depot. So these are also really interesting aspects to look at and maybe to get your chapter started with this topic. And then two more things that I find also particularly interesting and are very often overlooked are the actors intervening in conflicts and resistance movements. You can look at external versus internal actors, state versus non-state actors, and how they help to protract or exploit issues or intrastate conflicts. And that's not applicable only to civil wars in other countries, but also in the last US presidential elections. So you have an increasing number of external state actors who overtly or covertly intervene in intrastate conflicts. And they do that by exploiting the environment's resistance potential in order to increase their respective strategic influence. Also, you can look at internal and external non-state actors that take advantage of intrastate conflicts or political instability stemming from failing states. So current conflicts in Iraq and Syria, in the Ukraine, Yemen, Afghanistan, Somalia, Mali, and Libya are just a few examples. And how do we compare that to the resilience of, for example, ISIS, which is largely attributed to the protracted Syrian civil war, in which regional powers such as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey all sponsor local movements. International institutions like the role of the United Nations Blue Helmets play a big role. Weapons and arms sales to terrorists and resistance groups from the US and from other states also play a huge role in resistance and rebellious movements. So we can see what kind of actors might be influencing our resistance movements here in the United States. And actually in Foreign Affairs last January, I think, was a very interesting article about how the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States has been supported or is an outgrowth of support by international actors for decades. It's a very interesting article, and it helps us explain how resistance movements or revolutions or rebellions can take a long, long time to actually lead to change. And the last one that might get you off to a good start is to look at state responses to resistance. The government responses to it might depend on the form of government. So do you have an authoritarian, a dictatorial, a democratic regime? Do you have a new or a failing democracies? There's increased limited lethal repression of non-violent resistance in recent years, which seems completely counterintuitive. But there are also other tools to oppress resistance movements. So the reinforcement of the loyalty of elites, the infiltration and division of opposition movements, and the reinforcement of public claims to legitimacy. China, like I mentioned before, is a big example of the oppression of pro-democracy and independence movements in Hong Kong, in Taiwan. And compare that to the successful decolonization of Africa and Asia in 1945 to the 1960s, with international support of those independence movements. Or in Africa, where the nonviolent resistance movement in Algeria succeeded in pressuring the government to resign after 20 years as a president last year, 2 years ago, 2019. So that was a successful nonviolent resistance. And then we have two forces battling in the Middle East. So we have resistance and revolution movements in the Middle East. Resistance is how many Arabs and Iranians fight back against the US, Israel, and their conservative Arab allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The revolution for democratic freedoms, social justice, and pluralism that exploded in the Arab countries and in Iran since 2010, so almost a decade ago, shows us how determined ordinary citizens seek to remove autocratic, incompetent, or corrupt governments. So when we look at theme 5 with resistance, rebellion, revolution, reform, we might also want to look at what kind of government we have here in the United States, how Congress works, how state and federal government work, state and local governments work together, and how that influences our effectiveness in resistance movements. And then finally, when you think about your own chapter, you want to think about things that are in your city and that are relevant to your community. Look for interesting information and look, where do you find this information in your city? So think about what your city or area has that could be a really cool research project for your chapter. It does not have to be world changing. It just has to be something that is unique to your area. So maybe in Illinois, the Black Lives Matter movement might be a great felt in the city of Chicago and everywhere. And now President Obama is planning the Obama Presidential Center on the south side of Chicago, which is an area which is famous for issues between Black and white people. And on the website, you can find lots of information. There are 2 really cool videos, really short, you could watch with your students. And one thing the center is meant to be, it is meant to connect the economy of the south side of Chicago with the rest of the city, creating new jobs and opportunities. So President Obama wants to build a library with gardens and hire construction workers from that particular area to revive this economy, to build on the Black Lives Matter movement and to help lift people up in that area. And he also wants to honor the legacy of the marchers who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. So that might be a great movie or a great project for you to watch. And again, everyone who will be employed somewhere there will be someone who traditionally is not employed and will have opportunities to grow. And so with your chapter, if you're not right in Chicago, you can think about whether there's something similar in your area that you could support. Or you could think about the message the library center is sending for Black underprivileged communities and what it will do in Chicago. That is just one idea. And so before I close out, and I think we have a few more minutes if we want to have a little bit more of a discussion, I want to say a special thank you, of course, first to Ira for inviting me to speak about my favorite topic, and I tried not to go too much into political science. I want to thank Susan Edwards. She is the chair of the Honors Program Council, and if you have any questions, she is the Honors in Action queen. So feel free to email her. She will be more than happy to help you at any stage of your research project. And then I also want to thank my good friend and Professor Rahul Kane. He is the STEM representative on the Honors Program Council, and he wrote theme 5, Resistance. And he has a lot of great ideas too. He shared his information. And if you have any questions about theme 5, feel free to contact him as well. And so this is my information. So if you have questions for me, feel free to contact me as well, or contact Ira and they will send it to me. So now I'd like to open it up for a few questions. If there are any about the theme or about your Honors in Action project or about how to get your chapter started.
Since our write-up has to be actual, how can I, scholarly papers, it
Yeah.
makes it kind of rough to do something with, say, George Floyd, who he was basically murdered, but I haven't seen a lot of professors writing scholarly articles about something like that.
So if you look at, so do you mean specifically police or, okay, so the way I would approach it with a chapter is that I would look at Black Lives Matter, racial injustice movements in general, and would research that. I would look at criminal justice, at the criminal justice system and reforms that might be needed, and racial discrimination in criminal justice. You could look at policing. There are great reports and papers on policing and best practices. So Canada, for example, has a very different approach than the United States. The United States goes in and tries to solve problems once they have happened, and that's the traditional law enforcement approach. Canada and some jurisdictions have started for years to go into the community to build relationships with those traditionally more crime-prone or violent communities in order to build trust and to help prevent crimes from happening. So the relationship is very different. So you could look at things like that. You could look at personal testimony. NPR actually has a great channel, and I can send this to you, where they put two people together, like a victim of a violent crime and the father, or the father of a victim of a crime like this, and then someone, let's say from the police force or who committed that crime, and they put them together in the room for an hour or an hour 10 minutes, and then just let them talk. And after that time, they cut down the video just to the bare bones, and you get really raw material about how people experience issues and how they deal with that. So that would be a good resource as well. So that might be something where I would start.
I have to think about that.
Okay. And if there's something else, feel free to email me, and we can just share ideas or brainstorm about it. And maybe then I get a better idea of where you're going at.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I have spent years and years researching and everything is Leonard Peltier, and but I don't see a lot of people jumping on that bandwagon.
Okay. Yeah, and that's the challenge with any chapter project, that you want to get your entire chapter rallying together around one project, and there's
Right.
always compromise and convincing as well. So I know some chapters divided up, that every officer has to pick something they're particularly interested in, maybe within that theme, and then they basically go out, do some research, and present their case. And whoever is the most convincing, they will agree on to pursue that project. Some chapters just take a vote, so there are different ways of doing it.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any other questions or comments for Barbara tonight?
I'll say I also think some chapters don't like to cover sensitive subjects as much as other chapters, because they're afraid of opening that can of worms. I know in my chapter, our advisor set guidelines of, these are like 5 topics you cannot do a project on, and one was like always like abortion and like 4 other sensitive issues. So there could be other chapters in Illinois that are doing the same thing, saying we don't want to touch base on such sensitive matters. mainly because you don't want to, you don't want to make your college administration mad, and you don't want to make other people mad on campus. So I think it just depends on your college environment. I will go back to your presentation. I had no idea that England was thinking about doing a 6 p.m. curfew for men. I think you're right. I think there will be a rebellion on that. And the other thing to think about is, how is that going to impact local businesses if you're going to tell people you can't go out past 6 o'clock at night? And England's known for pubs and they're known for nightlife. So
yeah, I don't see it passing either. And there's already been a lot of controversy. But it's, so you, yes, I totally agree. And it's just interesting. What I just wanted to demonstrate is there are a lot of topics out there that all revolve around resistance and the top and theme 5. And you can take it almost anywhere you would like to take it to. And I really liked your remark that your chapter has certain topics they don't want to cover. And I think that's probably true of many chapters, even though we're not aware of that. And I think that's probably a smart move too, because in the classroom, certain topics may or may not be discussed as well.
Yeah.
I want to touch base on something Raymond just said, and then I got something else to go and talk about. The whole curfew thing, I think that's, sometimes people introduce things knowing that it's going to fail just to create discussion.
Yeah.
That recently with the Green New Deal is like 2 pages that said nothing. It just generated discussion. And that's all I'm really going to touch about that, because it's not really worth getting into. But when I first heard about this topic, I was like, things of this generation that are going to endure, that people are going to talk about in the future, I really don't see anything at this time that I think is going to endure that people will read in history books that's going to be more than a cliff note. And when you look back, the civil rights movement lasted for 15 years, maybe longer, I don't know. Rosa Parks was 1955. The March on Washington was 1963. And then the Civil Rights Act actually passed in 1964. I mean, that was a long road, and there's a lot of things that went on, and not all of it endured. We don't remember it all. And when you said the thing at the beginning about history, I was like, oh, that was my aha moment. I was like, oh, like these were big key factors that led up, and these are things that people remember, but people don't remember the whole 10, 15, 20 years of everything that was going on. So that's definitely something to think about. And I think if you wanted to go and talk, like when you brought up the Obama Library, that's definitely a modern day feature of something that's been going on for a while. Black Lives Matter kind of came up for a while. You kind of saw it go down a little bit. And then with the George Floyd thing, it came back up. And you're not really going to find a lot about George Floyd, because there's just, history hasn't written the story yet. The trial's still going on. It's too close to go and talk about. I don't mean like too close personally, but it's too close in timeline to see how it's going to affect anything. The best thing I can say about talking about endurance is something I learned in music appreciation class. People remember Mozart, they remember Beethoven, things of that nature. But if you read a book in a music appreciation class, Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, they make up one paragraph out of the entire book. Now, people know and may relate to Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley today, but overall, 100 years from now, they'll be lucky to be a sentence in a book, if that.
Yeah, and I liked your comment about how things change sometimes takes a long time. Right? We often think about rebellion and revolution, and that it happens overnight, and there's a big bang, and then things change. And often that is not the case. And so for chapters to look at projects, it's really a great way to look back and think about, well, how long did that take, or where did it originate? Because like you said, sometimes we don't even remember where it all started, because it was so incremental and so slow, and we only remember certain big movements.
And like you were discussing it in your presentation too about reform, you say, sometimes reform can be good, sometimes it can be bad, because not everybody's going to like it, not everybody's going to agree with it. But I think reform can happen way too fast. I think the better reform usually takes a little bit longer because it's more thought out. It's a lot more decisions have been made compared to fast reform, especially when it comes like criminal justice reform or police reform. I know that people are 50-50 on the fence when it comes to police reform, but when you're making that decision from a society based, you got to think, well, if we're going to reform this, how are we going to reform it in a way that everybody's going to be safe? And I think doing a quick decision like that and totally reforming criminal justice without even thinking long term down the road is bad. I think it's going to take a long time to do that criminal justice reform. I'll take Illinois for instance. From what I know of their police reforming bill that passed, is if you have a trespasser on your property and you call the police no longer have authority to tell the trespasser to leave your yard. They have to go up and they have to issue them a ticket and then they leave. They don't make the trespasser leave your yard. So that comes to the question of how do you keep your society safe versus how do you keep your police in check? So it's weird. It's going to be, I think it's going to be a long time to get the reform that we want to happen. But right now I think it's too fast.
Yeah, and some things your chapter then can look at in your action project is once you've done the research and you've found, oh, this is maybe something that does not address what we really want to address, either because it's an incremental change or because it's a reform that's actually counterproductive. What kind of project could we do as a chapter to change that? Maybe not directly, but to be a part of change? Or what can we do to raise awareness about this issue? Or how can we support a certain movement or whatever it is? So once you find that there is something lacking, that is a great way to start your Honors in Action project.
I think a good idea might be to compare how do they do resistance movements and reform in Germany, India, Australia compared to how the US typically does it. Like what's the difference between a US protest compared to a protest internationally? Because when you got like what Gandhi did compared to what we're doing now, or it's just it's nice to maybe compare that cultural difference, because I know they probably do a lot more peaceful protests internationally and we're more gung-ho. We're just gonna go at it like full bore. I don't know.
Yeah, and this is exactly what you want to do with your research, right? You want to cast your wet wide. You want to look at it from a global perspective, and then you come back to your local area and see, oh, what can we learn from that? Or why does that not work where we are? Yeah.
All right, any other comments, questions, concerns? All right, well, on behalf of I would like to thank Barbara again for presenting to us tonight. And on that note, I'm hitting the stop button on the recording.